Welcome members of the pack and newbies as well. The month of Halloween is upon us. All things spooky and macabre are being celebrated. And here on the channel we will be doing a month-long celebration as well. I like to call it my holiday horror hacienda. So come and join me tonight. Hope you enjoy this story. Stick around for some more. My name is Torrance. 3 nights ago, I was out cruising around town in my pickup truck, as I usually did. I don't have much in the way of friends or a social life, so I like to drive around at night and pick sights, smoke a joint, and then head on to the next spot. It was a ritual that I'd become accustomed to for as long as I could drive, and was always the highlight of my day. This particular night, the crisp autumn air had just finally begun to wrap its fingers around town after an unusually hot summer. I had the windows cracked slightly as I pulled into a warehouse lot I hadn't visited before. I was making a point this week to try to find some new spots around town, and this seemed as good a spot as any other. As I pulled in, I scanned the area to see if anyone was there. A few cars were parked in some scattered spots, but as far as I could see, I was the only one around at the moment. Not wanting to risk getting caught, I pulled my car around the building to the back lot. The narrow side street wrapped around the building and led to an even bigger and emptier lot behind. I swung my truck around to face the warehouses, just in case I needed to make a quick getaway. Put the truck in park. Then I got my phone out and opened up YouTube, pulling up the latest episode of Let's Read to occupy my mind while I packed my joint. As the soothing voice of the narrator filled my truck with the supposedly true horror stories of Reddit, I got to work, packing my pre-grinded green into the joint. Before you judge me, I wasn't exactly proud of this habit, having picked it up from a former boyfriend years ago. But it seemed to do the best job at temporarily filling the empty void that had been left behind. When I was convinced the joint was tightly packed, I finally lit up and felt the warm, fuzzy drip begin to slowly fill my head and veins. As I smoked, I began to observe my surroundings for the first time since I parked. That was the first time that I felt something was off, but I couldn't quite pinpoint it at first. I looked at the row of warehouses that seemed to stretch on past the now dark horizon. My windows were tinted a much darker shade than most vehicles, so I rolled them down to get a better look. But as hard as I looked, I couldn't quite figure out what exactly about this place was filling me with such a creeping sense of dread. I had been looking for any signs of movement and workers that might have come out for a smoke break and hadn't seen anything yet. I stared intensely at the back side of the warehouse, and suddenly a disturbing realization dawned on me. There were no windows, no loading docks, no staircases, not even a single door. The entire backside of the warehouse was completely blank. I scanned my eyes over the parking lot and outside the scattered light poles. There wasn't anything else back here. No vehicles besides my own, no individual parking spots painted onto the asphalt, no trash cans. Nothing. My gaze fell back onto the dark building, which now seemed more sinister and imposing in the wake of my newfound observations. A cold sweat had begun forming on my hairline, and for the first time I felt the gaze of some interlopers' eyes upon me from somewhere else. I sat in my truck, paralyzed with a growing dread unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was only when my joint had burned down to my fingers that I was ripped back into reality. I jerked back and flicked the still-lit joint to the ground and started my truck up. The engine whirred into life immediately, but I didn't take off just yet. I looked back at the buildings, which seemed even more defiant and out of place by the minute. I had no idea why the plainness of this warehouse scared me so much. I was being irrational, or the ganja was affecting my cognitive capabilities. Maybe I was tired. I went through a myriad of excuses, doing anything to justify the unusual circumstances in which I now found myself. I finally found the courage to put my truck in drive and leave the now tainted smoking spot. As I pulled up to the front, I took another look at the building. Everything was in place. Cars, front doors to the building, the basic shrubs and decorative trees. It stood in stark contrast to the almost half-rendered backside of the building. Another icy chill spread very suddenly throughout my body, and I remember the feeling of being watched from just moments ago. As far as I could tell, however, there had been no one around this entire time. Nobody that I could see, that is. Paranoia and tension was too much for my clouded stone brain to handle. I put the truck into drive once again and pushed down on the pedal harder than I had intended. The truck jerked forward and I sped off, leaving the mysterious factory and whatever secrets it may have held in my rearview mirror. I looked back once more as the buildings receded into distance, and as I did, a fleeting vision of a squad of black SUVs appearing out of nowhere flashed through my head. In that same second, the feeling of being watched and the mounting dread I had been experiencing for the past few minutes reached a fever pitch. I slammed on the gas, speeding ahead and leaving the mysterious building behind. I didn't look back again and kept my gaze straight ahead. Once I had parked in my usual spot next to my building, I sat still while the truck still idled. The sounds of internet horror stories still filled the pungent air around me, whereas before I'd be completely engrossed by the stories of the macabre and unusual. Now they were light years away. I went over to the strange events that had just unfolded a while ago. As I thought more and more about it, the less strange and unusual they seemed. It was the weed. It had to be. The stuff I was smoking was much lower quality than I had been used to. My brain, with all the horror stories and movies it had absorbed over the years, had a tendency to catastrophize every situation that could be remotely construed as menacing or dangerous. The building had parked cars in the front, the lights could be seen from the lobby doors, and the plain logo for an automotive assembly plant at the building house was clearly seen in the front corner, as well as the sign that had greeted me when I first pulled into the lot. But still, the oddity of the back of the building, the complete lack of any kind of loading equipment or docking areas, the aura of mystery and dread it filled me with. It couldn't all be a product of my paranoid, inflicted imagination. Breathing a sigh of relief, I took the keys out of the ignition and made my way up to the apartment. Once inside, I sat down on the sofa, shrouded in darkness, save for a few tiny streams of light that filtered inside. I looked all around me, making sure I was alone and unwatched. Whatever feelings I had caught while lurking at the factory seemed to have followed me home. As if he could read my mind, my ever-faithful feline companion, Ripley, meowed loudly and snapped me out of my trance. With his loud yet friendly purring and soft fur that I began instinctively caressing, I was immediately at ease. My thoughts now floating to the cat and the warmth that radiated from his furry body. I laughed at myself, now convinced I had supremely overreacted to the situation. I had psyched myself out before during my nightly cruises, but never anything like this. I felt like such a fool for thinking there had been anything wrong with the factory. Even with the weird backside, there were surely much stranger things in town. I could feel my eyelids growing heavier by the minute, so I lifted myself off the sofa with Ripley protesting loudly, and made my way to my bedroom. I undressed and climbed into bed. I called Ripley to join me, and he obediently hopped up. Lying next to my leg, quietly stroked his ginger fur as I slowly faded into slumber. That night I had an incredibly vivid dream that I was running frantically through a maze. Not a corn maze or a hedge maze like you'd see in an amusement park. The walls were plain gray, and it gave me the same feeling as a lab rat, frantically searching for the cheese in the middle. But there was no cheese in this maze, nor any other kind of snack. Instead, it was a never-ending series of dead ends and wrong turns, with only the same feeling from before that someone was watching me from afar to accompany me. I woke from the dream, soaked in a cold sweat yet again. I sat up and reached instinctively for Ripley, but he was no longer at my side. Looking up, I saw him perched on my windowsill, staring intensely at me. I called for him to join me on the bed, but he didn't react or move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes peering deeply into mine. I had a strange sensation in that moment that Ripley, until then my ordinary cat, was somehow studying me, waiting for me to wake up. I called his name once more, this time much louder and a bit more aggressive than I would normally. This broke him out of whatever trance he was in, and Ripley pounced off the window sill and skittered out of the room. Great, I thought to myself. Good job scaring your best friend. I got out of bed and started about my morning routine, washing up, brushing my teeth, scarfing down my poor excuse for breakfast. You know the drill. I took a longer route to work than I normally did, which would go right past the warehouse from last night. I thought seeing the place in the daytime and seeing the activity that would normally be there would put my mind at ease once and for all. When I approached the buildings, I slowed my truck down until it was fully stopped right in front of the warehouse. This particular stretch of road was off the beaten path, and only a handful of other factories and warehouses were scattered around. I looked at the building and the parking lot around it. Everything was as it had been the night before. I waited a few moments, hoping to catch someone getting out of their car or walking out of the building. I saw no one, and I was about to leave when it finally occurred to me. The lot, the cars, they were the same. Everything had been exactly as it had been the night before. The same cars were still parked in the same locations, nothing had moved an inch, and no new cars were parked in any of the empty lots. Surely someone would have left the building in the 12 hours it had been since I had last been there. Even if the workers in the factory worked 12-hour shifts, they would still be long over by now. The loud, blaring horn of a semi-truck sounded from behind me, and my eyes jolted back to the road. I stepped on the gas and sped off in very much the same way I had last night. I looked back in my rearview mirror to see the semi-truck pulling into the factory lot. I immediately felt a sense of relief, thinking to myself how silly I had been acting. The relief was short-lived, though, as I saw the truck pull around back to the other side of the building, where I knew there would be no loading dock for the truck to back into. I thought about what the truck could possibly be doing back there, but then my favorite song began playing on the radio, and soon I was grooving in my seat to the sweet sounds of Christine McVie, and I forgot all about the truck in the factory for the time being. When I got to work, which was a local pizzeria in case you were wondering, I asked some of my co-workers about the factory and if they had ever been around that area. They all said they hadn't, and when I brought up the name of the company the factory had housed, they all said they had never heard of it before. I shrugged it off and got to work preparing the ingredients and dough for the day. I felt my head begin to swirl as a throbbing migraine began spreading throughout my skull. I've had chronic migraines for as long as I can remember, and they are what originally led me to start smoking in the first place. Grabbed some of the extra strength pain pills I kept at the restaurant, and pushed on with my duties. The boss came up behind me a little while later, startling and causing me to almost drop the kneaded dough I had been tossing into a pie. He told me he had overheard me talking to the other coworkers and asked me to elaborate on what was going on. He was normally a pretty understanding guy and had gone out on a limb for me on more than one occasion. He listened intently as I relayed the events of last night and the nervous feeling I had gotten from the mysterious factory. Everyone knows I smoke, including my boss, and they always have a pretty good laugh at my expense whenever my paranoia gets the better of me. But when my boss didn't immediately say anything, I looked at him and his expression genuinely shocked me. He had an intensity about him I had not seen before. His eyes were glazed over, and for a moment I was reminded of Ripley, sitting on the windowsill earlier this morning, seemingly studying me. As my boss's gaze intensified, my migraine suddenly exploded, and I grasped my head in my hand, trying to will the pain away. My boss noticed this and finally spoke up. "I think you should lay off the green for a while," he said in a flat, almost monotone voice. I retorted, telling him that this wasn't because of the pot, but he retorted back, "Trust me, I think it's the best for you to sober up for a few days. You're starting to sound paranoid." I wanted to protest back, but he had already turned his back on me and was walking towards his office. I got back to my dough and pushed through the rest of the day, but as the hours went by, my headache only got more and more intense. By the time I clocked out for the day, I was close to throwing up because of the migraine. I told my boss before I left, and he told me to take the day off and get some rest, his voice filled with concern and compassion as it normally was. I thanked him and left for my truck. I took my usual route home, not wanting to pass the factory or give it another minute of my time. When I got home, I practically burst out of my truck and barged through the door to get to my medicine cabinet where I kept my real prescriptions. I grabbed 2 of the tiny pink pills and dry swallowed them without even flinching. I then collapsed onto my bed, and before I knew it, I was asleep. Thankfully, I didn't dream that night, and when I woke up, the sun was shining brightly on my face. Ripley was back on the windowsill, watching me intensely yet again. I looked down and laughed to myself. I hadn't even taken off my work clothes or my kitchen uniform. I haggardly shook my clothes off and hobbled to the bathroom to shower. My headache had dulled down considerably, but it was still there, throbbing in and out at random intervals. I let the warm water wash over my body as I tried to pull myself together. My thoughts reflected on the last couple of days and the weird events that had occurred since I parked in that factory lot. I must be having another episode, I said out loud, which merely doing so seemed to confirm it as far as I was concerned. When I was a kid, my migraines would cause me to lash out and sometimes break from reality for brief moments of time. The medication and then pot had kept these episodes at bay for a number of years now, but I knew deep down it was only a matter of time before they resurfaced. I muttered a prayer to myself, the first one in years, and then finished up my shower. Once dried off and fully clothed, I joined Ripley in my bedroom, where he was curled up at the foot of my bed. I swung my computer chair around and booted up my aging MacBook. Got caught up on all of my messages and emails, which admittedly wasn't very much, and spent the next 2 hours catching up on YouTube videos I had missed the previous day. After I was finished, I stared blankly at my computer screen for a moment, before pulling up a new window on my browser. I hesitated for a moment, then began typing in the name of the factory into my search bar. Immediately, the search engine informed me it failed to bring up any relevant inquiries. Impossible. I knew I was typing in the name correctly. I made sure of it, hoping it was a mistake or that my connection had timed out. I closed the window and reopened the search engine. I typed in the name again, but the same message flashed up on the screen almost instantly. Your search did not match any documents. I sat back in my chair, now deeply confused. There was no way that could be true. I had remembered the sign and the logo of the company vividly as if I were standing there looking at it now. I pulled up the map search engine and typed in the street name I knew the factory was located on. When the satellite image pulled up, I struggled to find the exact location of the factory. I looked up and down the stretch of road I knew it was located on, but I couldn't find anything. I traced my finger along the road to where I was sure the factory had been, but there was nothing but empty fields where the factory lot had once been. Perhaps it had been a newly built factory, and these images were outdated. Still, the creeping feeling of dread began to flood back to me, as I knew something was deeply wrong with this situation. I'm definitely having an episode, I thought to myself again. I knew I had to go back. I just had to be sure. This was beyond silly, beyond paranoid, but I had to do it. I got out of my chair and began putting on my shoes. I seemed to be on autopilot as I grabbed my keys and left the apartment. I had to be sure, I kept telling myself. I didn't even put on my music, which is something that I always did. I just kept my gaze forward as I drove to my destination with a single-minded determination. I wish I had just stayed at home. When I took the turn that led to the factories, at first I thought I had taken the wrong road. There were the factories that had lined the streets before, but I couldn't find the one I had just driven past yesterday. I was about to park and pull up directions on my GPS when I looked to my right and slammed on the brakes, bringing my truck to a jerking stop. I sat there, truck idling, with my eyes almost bugging out of my head as I looked into the empty field where I knew the factory had just been only 24 hours ago. Only there was no parking lot, no rows of factories, no shrubs, not even an indentation in the ground where the buildings had once been. It was as if the entire building had been uprooted, the pavement dug up, and replaced with sheets of grass. I couldn't move, nor I couldn't take my eyes off the scene that lay before me. This was a dream. This had to be a dream, a symptom of my latest episode. I parked the truck still in the middle of the road and began smacking my face, bringing on red welts almost instantly. I pinched, poked, prodded, did everything I could, but I was as alert as I had ever been. I turned off the engine and stepped onto the pavement. The ground beneath me felt weak, or maybe it was just my legs turning to jelly as I struggled to keep my breathing steady. I swear in that moment my heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I walked cautiously into the field, but suddenly broke into a jog, searching the tall grass for any sign of a building that had once been there. But there was nothing to find. It was gone. Vanished. How could that be? As I thought back to the events of the day before, I suddenly remembered the semi-truck that had honked its horn at me before turning into the parking lot and heading to the back. Could the trunk have been responsible? No, there was no way a truck could have packed an entire factory into the storage container. What the hell is going on? I said aloud. In that same moment, my temples exploded in a searing hot pain. I grabbed my head with both hands, trying to push the headache back into my brain. I almost passed out from the shock of the headache rushing back to me so fast. I had never had one like this before. I took my keys out of my pocket as I struggled to get back to my truck. I could barely open the car door and lift myself into the bed. My headache was so intense. I turned the engine back on and was prepared to drive off when something in the windshield caught my attention. I couldn't tell what it was at first, as my focus was going in and out due to my blistering migraine. I reached up and grabbed what looked like a small black dot. As I pulled it towards me, a thin black electrical cord fell out of the siding of my truck. I traced the cord with my hands from the small black object to the underside of my dashboard. I then looked back at the object in my hands and finally realized what it was. It was a microphone. Not the kind used in recording studios or stage productions, but the kind used for Bluetooth connections in more modern cars. The kind you use when you want to hide it from sight. My truck had no such devices, and I had never installed a microphone in my truck for any reason. I turned the microphone in my hands, studying it intently, though I couldn't identify a manufacturer or any kind of logo. Paranoia now deeply settling in, I violently ripped the cord from out of my dashboard and rolled my window down, but stopped right as I was about to chuck it out into the field. Was this really just me having another manic episode? Or was there something else? Were there sinister forces at work here? I wrapped the microphone up and put it into my glove box. I then did a violent turnabout and began speeding back to my apartment. The rest of the day I was locked in my bedroom, curtains pulled back, and only my desk light to illuminate my room. Ripley started clawing at my door and meowing for me to let him in almost instantly, further triggering all my alarm bells. His strange behavior for the past 2 days, coupled with my bosses, and now these new developments with the factory and the microphone. The microphone was sitting locked in my safe, hopefully to be used as evidence to my friends later. I had no idea what the hell was going on, but that microphone was the only proof I had. I called my boss and told him I was still sick and couldn't be in tomorrow. He didn't sound worried or concerned this time. The same monotone voice he had in the kitchen asked me if I needed to stop by. I told him no and then hung up. That night I tried as hard as I humanly could to stay up. I didn't want to close my eyes. I didn't want to know what would happen around me if I did. Sheer will kept me up until almost 3 a.m. That's when the migraine finally won out, and I surrendered to the pain and to the darkness. When I awoke, it appeared to be early morning. I looked at my phone and was horrified to see that it was indeed 7:50 a.m. But it had been the day after it was the one it was supposed to be. I had slept for almost 48 hours. There was no way that was possible. I would have felt a lot more fatigued than I did. I would have woken up sometime to go to the bathroom or get water. At the very least, I'd be severely dehydrated. As I was pacing around my room, I saw my safe lying on the floor of my closet where it had usually been. An awful thought crept through my head. I knelt down and spun the combination onto the dial, but I knew before I opened the door what I would find, or not find. The microphone was gone. The only proof I had had of the strange events unfolding around me was now gone, right before my very eyes. Whatever forces were at work, whatever was going on with the factory, it knew I knew. I tore my apartment apart, looking for any more recording devices. Curiously, Ripley was also nowhere to be found. I was about to give up hope of finding anything when I found something I knew had been there before. A single white card, like the kind you use for a business card. I found it underneath one of the floor mats in my living room space. It was blank on one side, and on the other side were just 2 words in a plain yellow font. Program and control. I'm now hiding out of my trunk on the outskirts of town. I'm tempted to drive out further, but something in my gut tells me I won't make it far. If anyone can tell me what is happening to me, please help. I used to think I lived in small town USA. Nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened here before. But in the span of less than a week, everything I thought I knew about this place has gone up in flames. Nothing makes any sense. The migraines are beginning to fade away now that the pink pills have finally kicked in. They always do the trick. I'll be asleep in a few minutes now. Just enough time for me to finish writing this post. There is something deeply wrong with this town. Even now, as I type these words, I can feel the gaze of 1,000 eyes bearing down on me. Someone, please help me. Tell me that I'm not crazy. Tell me this is all just a dream. Just a terrible, awful dream. This story and others can be found in my newest book, Full Moon Fables, now out on Amazon. Pick up a copy and get lost in a world of my own dreaded creation.